So there's finally another Steam-focused controller on the market, but is it any good? What's up everybody, Corey with Freaky Tech Reviews here, and today we're diving into the HORIPAD Plus from Hori. This controller was originally exclusive to Japan, but it just now became available in the US as of late December of 2024. So let's dive into it and see if it's worth picking up and considering. So in the box you get the USB-C charging cable, a wireless Bluetooth adapter for PC connection, which is great, a quick start guide, and then that's pretty much it. Now the first thing you'll realize when you hold this controller is that it feels very, very light and it almost makes it feel cheap. However, that's kind of by design because it doesn't have any haptics or rumble inside of it, which I'm not really a big fan of. We'll get more into that in just a little bit, but overall it just feels light right out of the box. Now, this is not a partnership with Hori at all. I pre-ordered this controller on Amazon when I saw it back in November, and I bought it with my own money, so they don't even know that I'm making this video. But the reason that I'm so excited about the Hori controller is because it's the first time that a controller has specifically been designed for Steam since the original Steam controller that was made by Valve. Now, this is not going to be a deep dive comparison between these two controllers. We'll talk about some of the similarities and functionalities here in just a little bit, but this is really going to be a focus and a review on the HORIPAD. Starting off with the specs and technical details of the HORIPAD, it is a wireless gaming controller and it comes with a 2.4 gigahertz USB dongle that offers Bluetooth connection. And for someone who has a motherboard on my PC rig that does not have Bluetooth, I very much appreciated this. But then it also does come with the proper USB connection cables, that way you can plug it right into your computer. It says that it has a 12-hour battery life, which is kind of mid on a controller. You really like to see a little bit more than that, especially if they're going to sacrifice haptics and not have rumble in it. You figure the battery life would last a little bit longer. However, that is just not going to be the case with this controller. Now, one of the cool things about this controller is that it has two modes. It has Steam mode and then Zenput mode, which is for wired mode only. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what these modes actually mean in just a little bit. But the way that you switch between the two modes is with the switch right here on the back. Speaking of the back, there are two back paddles that are remappable buttons for extra inputs, but then there's also these additional macro buttons right here on the bottom of the controller. That way you can map even more inputs to those specifically. For the triggers, it uses analog and digital switching for the L2 and R2 triggers, and they have this special design where they don't travel very far. I'm not a big fan of this personally because I like a little bit more, movement whenever I'm pulling my triggers, and these are very, very shallow. So something that personally I would just like to see a little bit more depth on because they are really, really shallow, but they are going to benefit you if you're doing something like playing fast-paced first-person shooter games or things like that. That way you can quickly pull the trigger and know that you're shooting your gun faster. I just don't like the way that they personally feel. But as far as the rest of the buttons on controller, I really like the overall quality of the buttons and the joysticks. It just feels like a nice controller. The buttons have a nice springiness to them, and they almost feel kind of thocky, which is nice. The D-pad leaves a little bit to be desired. I like the resistance of it and how it feels when you're clicking it, but it's not the most responsive, so I've definitely seen better D-pads. I really like the joysticks a lot. They're a little bit smooth and you can kind of lose them while you're playing certain games, but they do have a little bit of a grip around the ring right here. And overall, whenever I'm playing with these joysticks, I think they feel really comfortable in my hands. Now, if you've been a part of this channel for a while, you'll know that I really like having joysticks at the top of the device like the Steam Deck does, and it's kind of odd for me to see something that focuses so heavily on partnering with Valve on their SteamOS and not have that same design in the controller format. And the reason that's weird for me is because if we look at the original Steam controller, even though it is these touchpads on top right here and you have a joystick here, you still have the same top inputs near the top half of the controller. So I thought this was going to be a design that if you wanted to work with Valve and mimic their system, then you would put that same design and layout onto your controller. But this is going to follow a more traditional button layout. You have X and Y right here on the left and the top, and then A and B, and then right here you have kind of that classic Xbox style controller feel. And part of that is going to be because it does play through Windows 10 and 11, so you're going to be playing a lot of Xbox Game Pass games with this controller, so it is going to be important that it has that traditional feel. But for me, why it's not that bad on this controller specifically is because the handles are nice and long. When you have something to hold on to, it's okay to have a lower joystick like this. And while it's not as comfortable as something like my C2 grips to hold on to for a lower joystick, it actually does have a pretty good amount of grip for the hand right here, meaning that my thumb feels comfortable and supported while I'm holding the controller. Now, one thing I like about this controller is that it does have built-in turbo mode, but it is only available in the Zenput wired mode. And then as far as customization, it has full button remap mapping via Hori's device manager, which is fairly user-friendly and it's nothing too crazy or blow you out of the water. It's a typical macro reassignment software. One thing I also like about the build of this controller is actually where these back paddles are located. So whenever I'm playing, my fingers just kind of naturally rest along these buttons, but there's no weight to them, so I don't accidentally click them, but they're easy to just click like that, right? So you can kind of see, it's kind of hard to show you. I'll show some better B-roll of this, but really you can see where it just kind of naturally rests where your middle finger is. So it's easy to click them really well, whereas on a lot of controllers and devices, it's just not that comfortable to try to reach those back buttons. This I do think was inspired by the original Steam controller, because on the back, although it is a full back paddle right here, it does actually, fit nicely along where your fingers are so that you can easily hit the back buttons. And not every controller gets this right, especially when you have big hands like me, so I do like that about this Hori controller. Now, setting it up is extremely straightforward and it connects very, very quickly. You either simply plug in the USB dongle for wireless use and then you connect via Bluetooth, or you can switch between the Steam mode and the Zenput mode using the toggle on the back of the controller. And then one thing that's really nice is it's optimized to connect very quickly and easily to your Steam Deck via Bluetooth as well, so that you can just use your Steam Deck far away from you as an external monitor. However, this is not a perfect setup simply because the Steam Deck screen is a little bit small. Even though I have the OLED one that looks really good, I would still recommend having an external monitor and a docking station if you're going to play this way with a controller. But it's nice just to have the option if you need it. And then whenever it's actually connected to the Steam Deck, because the Steam Deck is basically Steam's big picture mode, all of the button functionality of the HORIPAD really come into play. So for instance, if you're pressing the 3 dots right here, it's bringing up the correct menu on the actual Steam Big Picture mode, and then if you press the Steam button in the middle, it will then pull up the correct Steam Big Picture actual menu mode, so you can change settings and things like that. So the one thing I will say is that latency on playing with the Steam Deck is not ideal. The Bluetooth, I think, from the Steam Deck itself is not quite strong enough for it to feel very responsive, and I think it's going to be fine for most people, but the reason that I noticed it is that compared to connecting directly to the Bluetooth dongle that it comes with, I just noticed a slight delay because the dongle with the computer feels like it's plugged in. It is very responsive and fast, and so I was playing a little bit of like Black Myth Wukong with it, where you've got to be able to react quickly and jump out of the way, and so latency is kind of a big deal whenever you're playing with a wireless controller, and I never had any issues. However, timing-based games on the Steam Deck, it felt just, I don't know, just a little sluggish sometimes. Now, obviously this controller is going to be best for Steam Deck and Steam games. It supports full Steam input customization, and it also enables capacitive touch thumbsticks for extra functionality, which is a really nice feature to have. As far as input mode, it just functions more like an Xbox controller specifically, and this is also the only way that you can use turbo mode and be able to adjust the trigger sensitivity. Now, like I said earlier, the HORIPAD comes with 2 trigger modes for your controller, and they're going to be analog and digital. Now, the difference in these is that for analog mode, that's going to be great for something like gradual input. For instance, if you're playing a racing game and you need to press a little bit more or let off a little bit as you're accelerating or letting off the gas, that's what analog mode is going to be really good for. And then for digital mode, that's an instant button press, which is going to be great for platformers and FPS games because it's immediately getting the input no matter how fast or slow you hit the button. And then what I really like about that is the way that you switch back and forth between these modes is right on the back of the controller. So right next to where you'd switch between wired mode or Steam mode, you can also just switch between analog or digital mode with your triggers. So I really like just how quickly you can change that, and you don't have to go into menus and settings to be able to do that. Now, one thing I will say overall is that I do not like the trigger depth of this controller. I touched on that a little bit earlier, but whether you're using analog or digital, it just doesn't travel very far, and I'm not a big fan of that, especially if we're looking at analog mode where you need to be able to kind of do pressure sensitive presses on the trigger. There's just not enough room. There's just not enough room when you're pressing this down to know how far you're pushing it down. I just don't like that personally, so that's definitely a knock on this controller for me. Now, this controller also has little LED indicators for battery and pairing success. And speaking of battery life really quick, I know earlier I said that it doesn't have really great battery life at only 12 hours, but it does have a built-in auto power off after 90 seconds if it's unpaired, and then 15 minutes of inactivity if it is paired. So it is designed to kind of help you out in that regard, but it just needs to have a bigger battery in it. One One thing I do want to touch on with the ergonomics of this controller that I actually really don't like, because there's so much that I do like on this controller, is that whenever you're reaching for your start or option button, as most games have, that's going to be the little burger icon here or this little share button right here. And the problem is that they have the connection button right here and then the 3 dots right here for one of your Steam menus, where you would normally have the option and start button. So I don't like that, because I find myself accidentally pressing these lower buttons right here as opposed to having to reach up here, and you really have to reach further, even with me with big hands, to hit the proper button to pause a game. And so it's just kind of a pain having to do that. I think that's kind of a design flaw on this controller. If I could redo it, I would switch the top 2 buttons with the bottom 2 buttons, and I think it would be just right. So there's a lot of things to like about this controller, and there's a lot of things that make it just plain not perfect. So starting off with my final thoughts on it, at $60, I think that's a fair price point for what you're getting. I think the problem is that when you first receive it, it's going to feel cheap. It just does. But after I played with it for a couple of days and kind of not abused it, but really worked it, I do think the quality is there. I think the reason it feels cheap is just simply because it's light. Not having haptic feedback and rumble support in the controller is something that I don't personally like. I don't know why they wouldn't include that, to be honest. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the button inputs between the joysticks, the triggers, the bumpers, the D-pad's okay, but every part of this controller, it does just feel good, and I think you'll get a good amount of life out of it. I also like the fact that it's just plain designed for Steam and works well with SteamOS, but it's not limited to just working with SteamOS. You can use this controller for anything that you need to hook it into, as long as you have the cable with it. So I think just from a build quality perspective, I do like it from that standpoint, and the fact that it just easily integrates into your Steam Deck life if you want to use your Steam Deck and not actually hold it. I do think from that regard, it's going to work really well if you take it to travel with you, or if you just want to hook your Steam Deck into like a console type mode at the TV. I think that's going to be one of its strong points. But as far as my overall assessment on this controller, it doesn't really stand out anywhere. If we look at the original Steam controller next to it, not only is it just a very unique controller and very well built, but it just has a special edge to it that makes it not only noticeable, but it just works better. I mean, these dual sliding inputs right here that can work as a mouse or just as normal joysticks, I mean, it was special. And I wanted to see something that was special come along whenever I first saw this. And it's one of the reasons that I pre-ordered it, is because I thought maybe it's got something up its sleeve that I wasn't expecting. And while it does have some nice features, it doesn't have anything that really blows you out of the water. So while I can't really say that, yes, you gotta get this controller and you have to have it, I can say that if you do get it, I don't think you'll be disappointed. I actually really do like it. It's just not perfect. It's kind of middle ground. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you think of the HORIPAD Steam controller? Is there anything that I missed about it, or do you have one or plan on getting one? Let me know down in the comments. And if you haven't already, definitely subscribe to and join the Freaky Tech family. We're growing like crazy this year, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. But again, I'm Corey with Freaky Tech Reviews. I'll see you next time. So real quick before you go, YouTube thinks that you might like this video or this video, so if you want to keep exploring the channel, then be sure to check those out. Have a good one.